The Bible tells us that we humans are God's handiwork. We're God's children by virtue of his creating our forefather, the first man, Adam. But the society that we live in today, even here in America, denies that we have an almighty creator. This is what the children have been taught for decades in the public school system. They've been taught that evolution accounts for our existence, godless evolution, not creation. It's part of the public school curriculum, the message drilled into your children and grandchildren. The godless evolution that's taught as fact in public schools says that life on this planet began 1 billion years ago or more, when some chemical accident in the ocean brought together some molecules by accident in a way that they could reproduce themselves. Trillions of other accidents supposedly happened, producing one-celled organisms after that, like bacteria. And then the evolution teaching claims that other accidents brought one-celled organisms together into multi-celled worms, then fish, then birds, land animals, and finally humans. All of this supposedly by accident. Millions upon millions upon millions of accidents that all ended up eventually producing our children and our grandchildren and everyone we know. Now, there are some scientists who dispute the evolution theory and uphold the Bible instead, but they are very few and far between today, because the institutions of higher learning and the scientific institutes throw them out, they expel them. Just like being banned by Twitter and Facebook for posting prohibited ideas, the scientific community expels any scientist who defends the Bible. They lose their job, they're excluded from the scientific community. That's been documented in the 2008 documentary titled Expelled by Ben Stein, which you can see online or on DVD. And students who are seeking to become scientists are flunked out by their schools if they don't embrace the evolution teaching. It's been that way for decades now, so there are very few scientists left who uphold that we were intelligently designed by our Creator. Well, what evidence is there that the Bible is true? And what evidence is there that the Bible is inspired by the Almighty Creator of heaven and earth? The Bible itself contains such evidence, and we also find evidence of the Creator in the creation around us. Romans chapter 1, verse 20 says, "Ever since God created the world, his invisible qualities, both his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly seen. They are perceived in the things that God has made. So those people have no excuse at all." But people often choose between God and evolution based on emotion, their wants and their desires, rather than on factual evidence. One of the main reasons that people want to dismiss the idea of a creator who holds us accountable for our actions is that they want to do things the Bible says not to do. If God doesn't exist, then they're free to do as they please. I know that this is the motivation behind many people's rejection of God, because it was my own motivation when, as a young man, I rejected all religion. And the reason why many people feel free to dismiss the idea of a creator who holds us accountable is that they can point to godless evolution instead as an alternative explanation for why we are here and why there is life on earth. That theory of godless evolution is what I pointed to when, as a young man, I chose to give up belief in a creator. It was back in the 1960s, and I read the book On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. That book was published in 1859, and it introduced that theory of evolution. This is the paperback copy that I read back then, and inside the cover is the date that I wrote inside it, the day that I got it. And I read it back then in the 1960s, and it helped me to decide to reject the Bible and believe in evolution instead. I also read a book titled The Origin of Life by Alexander Ivanovich Oparin of the Soviet Academy of Science. Atheism and godless evolution was the official position of the communists of the USSR, Soviet Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Well, nowadays, the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, wears a cross around his neck, and he denounces what he calls godless America for the sexual immorality that's promoted here in this country. How times have changed. But as a young man back in the 1960s, I read a number of other books on the topic by famous scientists, and they all rejected religion in favor of a godless explanation for life on Earth. And so did the colleges and universities that I applied to. I wanted to join that scientific community. I hoped to become a scientist myself at that time. And those colleges and universities rejected the Bible's explanation for life in favor of evolution. So I personally did enough study of godless evolution theory to be fully convinced and to be able to present its supporting arguments in defense of it. Over the years that followed, however, I later discovered the truth of the Bible and what it reveals about our Creator, God. And I can tell you with certainty that the godless evolution theory fails the test when compared with the Bible. I've seen in detail the evidence on both sides, and the Bible wins. So how do we reach people who've been told that the Bible is unscientific? Well, one way is to look more closely at the Bible itself and to show that that claim is not true. And if we do that, if we look closely at the Bible, we'll find that it is so scientific, ahead of its time, that it actually offers proof of divine authorship. Only the Creator could have written it, not those Hebrew sheep shepherds and goat herders who had the Bible thousands of years ago. Only the Creator could have written it, so the Almighty Creator must exist. Take, for example, the cycle of water. Where does water come from, the water that feeds the rivers and streams all over the earth? Well, the ancient Greeks had scientists, and those ancient Greek scientists believed that the earth itself was full of water under the ground, and that water all came up and fed all the rivers and the streams. But Hebrew passages in the Bible that were written even centuries before those Greek scientists tell the true story. The Old Testament explains that water evaporates as vapor, rising into the sky, only to come down again as rain. Long before scientists understood that, God understood it, and he put it into the Bible because he created the water cycle. Psalm 135:7 says, "He causes the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth." And that was written more than 1000 BC. Job 36, beginning in verse 27, says, "He draws up the drops of water which distill as rain to the streams. The clouds pour down their moisture, and abundant showers fall on mankind." That cycle of water evaporating from the sea, condensing as clouds in the sky, and falling as rain to the ground could not have been figured out by Hebrews herding sheep on the mountainside. It had to be given to them by the Almighty Creator, the one who inspired the writers of the Bible and told them what to write. Our modern world is accustomed to TV weather charts showing circulating winds and storms. We see them on TV all the time, or on our smartphone when we look at the weather forecast. But it would take God looking down from the sky to give that information to the ancient Hebrews. So it was only under divine inspiration that the writer of Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 6 could say this around 1,000 years before Christ. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. The Hebrews who were on the mountainside shepherding their sheep could not have seen this. We see it today from satellite photographs and from weathermen communicating with each other instantly all over the earth. But the ancient Hebrews who wrote the Bible were able to write this because God explained to them how the wind circles around like that. But even more fascinating and convincing evidence of the Bible's divine inspiration is found in what it says about the written code behind all living things. We humans started out as a single fertilized cell, each one of us, a single fertilized cell in the womb of our mother, smaller than a period at the end of a sentence. Inside that cell is the DNA that determines everything about us, our eye color, our skin color, and everything else. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, which is that familiar double helix-shaped molecule you often see pictured in connection with the human genome. That DNA is actually a set of coded instructions that tell the cells of our body how to build bone, muscle, hair, eyes, and every other part of our body, and where to put it as it assembles the body together in the mother's womb. Well, it took about 100 years from when scientists first discovered the existence of DNA until they learned how to read the code. The amazing thing about DNA is that it really is writing. It's writing. It's very similar to written computer code. Computer code spells out instructions based on a sequence of 2 characters, which we represent as 0 and 1, whereas DNA code uses a sequence of 4 characters, represented by the letters GATCCCTAAGG. Dr. Francis Collins was in charge of the Human Genome Project that was tasked with being able to figuring out how to read that human genome and record it. Well, Dr. Francis Collins, who was in charge of that genome project, recognizes the similarity between DNA and computer code. He refers to DNA as a language in his New York Times best-selling book titled The Language of God. The subtitle of the book is A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief. Well, he calls it the language of God. The DNA code is the language that God used to write down the instructions for building our bodies in the womb. Now, I myself used to work at a secular job for a number of years where I was a computer programmer, and so I recognize the similarities between DNA code and computer code. In fact, the codes are so similar that you can exchange things from one to the other. Scientists have actually translated a copy of the encyclopedia from computer language, like you'd have an encyclopedia on your laptop or on your smartphone or online. They've translated that digital encyclopedia into DNA language, DNA code, and they've put the entire encyclopedia on a strand of DNA. That gives you an idea of how much information a single strand of DNA can contain. So you can look at the DNA strand that they put the encyclopedia on using a DNA sequencer and read the encyclopedia. So the DNA in a mother's womb really contains written instructions, writing on how the baby is to be formed. Well, what does that have to do with the Bible? Well, even though the ancient Hebrews could not possibly have known anything about code written in DNA, they didn't see anything as small as molecules, they didn't have those electron microscopes, still the Bible speaks of a written scroll describing a baby's body parts before they were formed in the womb. which is exactly what DNA does. First, the psalmist talks to God in Psalm 139 about how he was designed and built in his mother's womb. Psalm 139:13 says, "You made all the delicate inner parts of my body and knit me together in my mother's womb." And Psalm 139:16 in the King James Bible says, "Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect, and in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none among them." The psalmist says that the various parts of his body were written before they actually came into shape. In the English Revised Version, it says, "Thine eyes did see mine unperfect substance, and in thy book were all my members written, which day by day were fashioned, when as yet there were none among them." Some modern translations spin this a little differently, but the more literal translations follow this same pattern. The literal standard version says, "Your eyes saw my unformed substance, and all of them were written on your scroll, the days they were formed, and not one among them." Well, what was God's book or scroll that the baby's body parts were written on before they were formed? It was the DNA strands inside that fertilized egg in the mother's womb, the DNA strands that cause that single cell to grow into the baby. That's the place where the future body members were written before they were formed, written in the DNA instructions. Now, obviously, God could not have given the psalmist those words, molecules or deoxyribonucleic acid or DNA, when inspiring the ancient Hebrew writer. Those words and concepts were unknown to people back then. But God does say in this scripture written 3,000 years ago that the details of our bodies were written down before we were born. Well, computer code doesn't write itself. Companies hire people to write computer code, just like they hired me back then when I was a computer programmer. And DNA code doesn't write itself either. God wrote the DNA code that contains the written instructions on how to form and grow each living creature. And that's what the Genesis account of creation refers to when it says at Genesis 1 verse 11, "And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so." Those seeds contain instructions that are written in that DNA code, instructions for growing the complete plant. Inside each little tiny seed are those written instructions for the complete plant, even a 60-foot tall tree. All the instructions for it, its branches and everything, are written inside that DNA code in the seed. And the Bible, written thousands of years before humans discovered DNA, says that God put those instructions in writing for a seed to grow into a plant and for a baby to be formed inside the womb. And God used that genetic language to design and create all living creatures that we see around us. He wrote the code that determines all their features and all their behaviors. Now, atheistic evolution claims that all the living creatures came into existence through a series of accidental mutations. They say the DNA of a tiny one-celled animal was damaged over and over again by radiation or some other accident. And those accidents resulted in new and improved code, far more complex creatures, every living thing on Earth. Now, we know that viruses can mutate. We can hear about it on the news that COVID-19 has gone through another mutation. But viruses are just tiny groups of molecules, and virus mutations just make small changes to the virus itself. They never turn the virus into a bacteria. They never caused the virus to evolve into a worm or a fish or something else. Our observations tell us that when the DNA code of living organisms is mutated by some accident, it always results in harm rather than good. It doesn't result in improved code being written. It just damages the code that was already there. Modern evolution theory, though, is based on the idea that DNA mutated over eons of time to cause a worm to become a fish, and to cause that fish to become a land animal, and that land animal to become an ape, and that ape to become the first human. Well, this may sound simple, turning a fish into a land animal, but that would take an incredible number of trillions and trillions and trillions of genetic modifications. And accidental changes to DNA don't improve them. Accidental changes to DNA almost always break something. Just as accidental corruption of your computer code causes your device to malfunction. When the computer code inside your device is accidentally changed by static electricity or some other intervention, it doesn't improve the programs you're running on your device. It breaks them so they don't work anymore. Well, the same is true for genetic code. Consider the eye, for example. Huge volumes of DNA code instruct our body cells how to build the eye while our bodies are being formed in the womb. Evolutionists claim these instructions for making the eye wrote themselves gradually through a series of accidents. But the eye doesn't work unless it's complete. That's an example of irreducible complexity, which means its parts are useless without the whole eye. The lens doesn't do any good unless it has a retina to focus on, and the retina is useless without the lens. So godless evolution would require accidents to create a working lens and a working retina at just the right time for each of them to work with each other, all by coincidental DNA mutations. Well, you'd really have to have blind faith in evolution to believe that something like that could happen by accident. When plants and animals or humans reproduce, the process copies the DNA exactly from the parent into the child and does that generation after generation. As the scripture said, the seed of each plant is in it. The seed of the plant is in it to reproduce the same plant again. It's sort of like someone typing on a keyboard to reproduce a document by retyping it. And then someone else takes that copy and retypes it again, and someone retypes it again. Well, if you make a typo, a mistake while typing, if you type the wrong character, it wrecks the document. It doesn't improve it. Well, the series of accidental mutations that would be needed for evolution to happen would be like people retyping copies of the poem Mary Had a Little Lamb and making so many typos along the way that they end up typing the Constitution of the United States instead, by gradually changing the poem into the Constitution through a series of accumulating errors that all resulted in something good that made sense. Well, that could never happen, and neither could the evolutionist's supposed series of accidents change a fish into a human being, no matter how many years went by. The DNA of any organism is more complex than the Encyclopedia Britannica. Believing that a series of accidents could write the DNA code to produce a human child, your grandchild, that's like believing that a series of explosions in a printing plant could accidentally produce a complete Encyclopedia Britannica. But because they reject belief in the Creator, the scientists they desperately want to believe that all of this could happen by accident, and so they put blind faith in the evolution theory. They accuse us of putting blind faith in the Bible, but the Bible's explanation of where we came from, an intelligent designer who wrote the DNA code, that makes much more sense than godless evolution. Well, this morning we've looked at just a fraction of the evidence supporting the Bible and disproving godless evolution. You can find more evidence like this by going online to the website answersingenesis.org. That's answersingenesis.org. Or the site biblicalscienceinstitute.com, biblicalscienceinstitute.com. Or the website intelligentdesign.org, intelligentdesign.org. Each one of those websites contains a tremendous amount of information showing that godless evolution could not possibly have happened and that it's not a valid alternative to the Bible's explanation. But what each person does with this information depends not only on their mind, but also on their heart. And the heart is treacherous. Those who want to do as they please rather than be accountable to God, they'll find some way to dismiss the evidence. In any case, we believers have the evidence available to defend the truth of the Bible, and we can reach out with that evidence to help unbelievers see the truth. Although I was misled as a young man and I rejected God and the Bible and believed that godless evolution explained everything, I eventually saw the evidence, realized that evolution didn't make sense, and that the Bible was true. And we can pray that our loved ones will do the same.